People Are Strange. And boy, the story behind that song is very funny. Just very briefly, because it's not going to be a super long bio, because there isn't much time between the album that we've covered, Waiting for the Sun, their third one, and this one. So a lot of the bio is going to overlap. But People Are Strange was written when Jim Morrison was feeling depressed, and he took a hike with other members of the band. And apparently he went up to the canyon feeling depressed, and he came down from the canyon feeling euphoric. And the end result was that People Are Strange was written. It was one of the last tracks written for the album. The vast majority of the tracks written for this album were written at the same time as the tracks from the self-titled album, The Doors, was written. We have not covered that album yet, but so it's kind of funny. We're working backwards. We started with their third album. We're now going to their second. Eventually, we'll get to their first. So we're kind of doing it in an unusual way because we're working backwards to the origin story. If you want to hear, though, some of the origin story of The Doors, I would invite you to check out our earlier episode on The Doors. The segment was for Waiting for the Sun, and we go quite a bit into the formation of the band. But here's some of the basics on this album. It is The Doors' second album. It was released on September 25th, 1967. It was actually released 8 months after their debut, so the turnaround time was quick. As you might imagine, it was released that quickly because they said strike when the iron is hot, and the Doors had become a huge cultural phenomenon through the summer of 1967, which, you know, however you feel about the Doors, to be the cultural phenomenon in music in 1967 in the summer is saying something, because that was certainly a competitive field to have that moniker. I think any time from 66 to 69 would be competitive, but 67 in particular is just, if you look at the top 50 albums from that year, it's like a who's who of famous albums. It also was released pretty much exactly a week after that famous Ed Sullivan appearance that we talked about in the previous episode, where they were told, they sang Light My Fire, and they were told not to say Girl, We Couldn't Get Much Higher, and whether you believe Morrison did it on purpose or was nervous and forgot to do it. That was watched by lots and lots of people, as Ed Sullivan was, and added to the mystique of the band, and of course led to that funny story that we always tell, where Ed Sullivan's, the person backstage said, "You're never going to play the Ed Sullivan again," and Jim Morrison famously says, "That's okay, man, we already did." And so, which it's one of those great stories that it seems like it's true too. It's the rare story that seems like it actually happened, as opposed to being apocryphal. Yeah. So,
John, how many people do you think actually got high because he said that on the Ed Sullivan show? Do you think that it actually had an influence on people?
It corrupted everyone.
Yeah, I can't even answer that question, because it's just, I think anybody who was looking to get high in 1967 was fine.
We're gonna do it anyway. Yeah.
I don't think they looked at Jim Morrison and said, "Oh boy, that's gonna that exactly. One song there got me there." So anyway,
that was John. That was episode 9. We talked about that for that album, Waiting for the Sun.
Thank you, because I was going to peek into that while we were doing the review, but Josh, as always, you are on top of it, which is awesome, so thank you. Episode 9, if you want to find out about that. So this album reaches number 3 on the Billboard charts and gets platinum status. It had 2 singles, the 2 tracks that we've actually billboarded here, Love Me 2 Times and People Are Strange. They both were top 30 hits, but this album was not considered to be as commercially successful as they'd thought, and some of that was because it overlapped with their debut. And to give you an idea of where the Doors were at this point, this album stayed on the Billboard Top 200 for 63 weeks, which is a long time. And their debut stayed on for 122 weeks, including a total overlap of the 63 weeks that Strange Days was on. So it was on before it was on the same time on it, and then it actually stayed after it for a while. And then the interesting thing about the Doors is that they had 2 distinct periods of time, the 80s and then the late 70s and then in the early 90s, where they had renaissances. The early 90s one was because of the Oliver Stone movie, and the late 70s was because it was the beginning of the myth building and they released the greatest hits. But the album, the Doors album, recharted in the Billboard Top 200. So I don't know the exact amount of weeks it's been in the Billboard Top 200, but it had another couple of lives in the Top 200 as well. And a lot of that is because the Doors, as we've talked about in the previous segment, but to go here, and I think we all agreed on this, the Doors are as much about the image of the Doors as they are the albums themselves. And that is not to knock the Doors, but that's the enduring why the Doors are the Doors in some ways. The iconic photos, the image, the cultivation of the mystique, I think. Yep. And I think this album is as much of a Mystique Doors album as there can be, and a lot of the reason that's given for why that is because the Doors, and you're going to love this, Matt, the Doors listened to Sgt. Pepper, and as most people were who listened to it, they were blown away, and they looked at it as, we really need to begin experimenting and doing all kinds of interesting stuff. So they're recording white noise and playing it backwards on a tape recorder. They are using what's called musique concrete, which is
that's
taking
come up before.
Yep, which is taking
Frank Zappa.
sound. Yep, which is taking sounds and found sounds and then playing them backwards, or in the Doors case, what they did was they played their instruments in different ways, sometimes even unusual ways around the sound to hear what it would sound like with almost the ambient sounds. For those that know, like Brian Eno and stuff, he played around with concepts of that a lot later, and when we get to him, we'll talk about that plenty. But so yeah, they're doing musique concrete. This whole album was recorded on the 8-track recording machine, which is kind of funny because at the time that was considered to be like as cutting edge as it gets. But of course, in modern times, the 8-track is considered to almost be like a relic of another time, right? But it sounds, for those that are purists in terms of sound, they say that this is as much an album that shows what the 8-track sounds like as a recording device as almost any other album at the time. And they also spent quite a bit of time using what instrument, guys?
The Moog.
I was going to say the
synthesizer. No, the Moog synthesizer is also prominently featured in this. And Ray Manzarek was messing around with it, and he has a lot of funny quotes about utilizing the Moog and how you have to live with it, and it's a bizarre instrument and stuff like that. But it is here, and I'm sure someone will mention it. Another couple things before we get into it. This album features Douglas Lubon on the bass. The first album by The Doors only had the bass on a couple of tracks, and it was another studio musician. This album has the bass on all of the tracks. So it's not quite a Wrecking Crew type deal, but it is like a guest player coming in, right, and playing as a session musician. And that would be the case for all of the rest of the Doors albums, but they would use a variety of session bassists and didn't replicate them on future albums. And sometimes they would use multiple guest bassists on their album. So with the exception of their debut, which only has the bass in a couple tracks, the Doors do have a bassist in their sound, but they don't have a bassist as a human being in the band. So something to be aware of there. And then many of the songs, as I mentioned before, are written at the same time as the songs on The Doors. And it's considered to be some of Morrison's most contemplative songs because he is pretty famously at a precipice between becoming famous and struggling with, being a frontman, but also being somewhat private and shy in his natural persona, and also his substance abuse is starting to ramp up here. Not quite at where it would be later next year when he was doing Waiting for the Sun, but it's starting to get more heavily into it. And a lot of the tracks are about sort of him trying to reconcile that. And, I know we focused on 2 tracks so far, and there's plenty of others, but People Are Strange is a really good example of lyricism that goes down sort of that track. And shortly after this is the scenario where Morrison gets arrested in Connecticut after being maced by the cop for being uncooperative backstage, and that is sort of viewed as the point where Morrison crosses the threshold into being the Morrison that I think is remembered, right? Sort of complex, substance-addled, dark, stuff like that. He wasn't quite there in terms of his narrative at this point. So there you go. That's a little bit of a history of leading up to this album. We started with Josh last time. Matt, what are your thoughts on this album?
So, I I think the Doors are just, the more I'm listening to them and just going into that, they're such a fascinating band to me. I don't. First of all, I like the album fine. I think I probably liked it a little bit better than Waiting for the Sun, and I don't think they're a great band overall. I just think that they're kind of ridiculous. And I mean, actually, John, I'm surprised you didn't pick Horse Latitudes as the opening montage track, because that would have been very fun to listen to.
I do have a good story about Horse Latitudes, though, that I'll share at the end. So
I mean, it just makes me I'm rolling my eyes, going like, whatever. But like the idea that this band, which I think is very interesting and very unique musically, and I think particularly for me, I think Morrison's certainly a part of that. But as far as the musical. The musical representation of that, it's with Ray Manzarek and the keyboards that he's playing, and the variety of different sounds that he's getting from that. You know, some of it's kind of like a harpsichord, some of it's like an old timey like saloon piano playing that he's doing. You know, some of it's just this like organ. So that's a very distinctive Doors sound, and so I certainly give them credit for that. They are their own band. There's no other band that really sounds like them. And then you have Morrison's antics and everything on top of that, and they're just this iconic type of 60s band. But the fact that they're holding the charts for that long is very fascinating to me, that his charisma, his mystique is so, it resonates so much with people that it can just cause them into this other stratosphere of being one of the most popular bands around. But at the same time, musically, I'm kind of like, it's not bad. Some stuff I really like. I think I really like "Love Me Two Times." I think that might be my favorite song on the record.
Same.
I think that the standout track to me that I didn't know before, which was "My Eyes Have Seen You," I thought that was a really good song too. And I think that the similarity between those two songs is that's where Morrison kind of belts out a little bit more, which I think I mentioned the last time we covered them. I like Jim Morrison kind of screaming and kind of getting really into it, as opposed to the
like
droning.
feral Jim Morrison.
Yeah, I want feral Jim Morrison. I don't want droning Jim Morrison.
Yeah.
You know, he's like, I
wrote that down too.
Yeah,
I agree.
Your Lost Little Girl, I liked there was a guitar part in that I thought was that was interesting. That was a little bit more maybe modern. You know, it wasn't as dated, and so you have that kind of cool guitar part that's going on, and then he's just like, "Your lost little girl," and I'm like, okay, all right, whatever. So I don't dislike the Doors. I'm certainly not in love with them. I think that they are overrated musically, but I just find them so fascinating because they're just this really. You know, I keep saying the word unique. I'm trying to think of a better word, but like that's essentially what they are. So I think I like this album overall. I think it's ironic that when the music's over is 11 minutes and you're just like, is it over? Is it really? You know, like it just keeps going. You know, I think the song that I don't like.
Well, on the first track they had the end, so there's a theme that they're running with. Long tracks.
Yes. Yes, and I think I think the last album we did wasn't quite that long, but it was still longer.
Well, it was supposed to be. Remember, it was supposed to be like a 26
Oh, that's
minute.
right. Yeah,
but they didn't allow that to happen.
Right.
So.
I think overall, like Horse Latitudes is whatever. It's kind of a throwaway. But I think I Can't See Your Face in My Mind, the second to last track, the penultimate, if you will. That was probably my least favorite. That really didn't do a whole lot for me. But yeah, it's interesting. Because even though I don't love the Doors and I find them kind of ridiculous, I still don't mind it. It's still kind of it's fine. It's kind of I think I'll go back to my last thought will be I think Ray Manzarek's keyboard playing is very. I love the melody behind what he's doing there, and I think that's what I gravitate towards the most. There's some really cool key parts that he's playing with various different sounds that are put onto it, and I think that more so than anything is what intrigues me most about the band in general, and particularly this record.
So before I get to Josh, can I ask you a question, Matt? And Josh, you can feel free to jump in. Are the Doors a cliche because they were first, or are the Doors a cliche because the Doors are a cliche? Like, what is it? Like, is it in retrospect? You know, and that's what I always find interesting. You know, because
I don't think they were a cliche when they came out.
Right.
Yeah.
That's what I'm saying, though. But like now they sort of like.
Yeah.
Like, I'll get to that later. I'll revisit that because there's something I want to say, but I don't want to steal your thunder, Josh. So go ahead. What was your take, Josh, on this album?
Well, I think Jim Morrison is like a spooky, sexy warlock that puts spells on people, and that's why people love this album so much, or The Doors, why the first album lasted the way it did. He's got such a great, like, sultry voice, and he, as we said before, he, like, exudes sexiness, and, like, and you can get that on this album. I like this album more than I did the last one we talked about, their third album.
Waiting for the Sun. Yep.
Yeah, Waiting for the Sun. I like there's a lot of, well, it's breezy for one thing. That's always appreciated, as we've said. And I'm unfortunately going to mimic a lot of the same things that Matt said. I do like a lot of, like, the organ and synth effects, which I guess is the Moog that they're using, like in Strange Days. The space synth effect works well for that song. And this album as a whole is like almost like a weird, like, Halloween nightmare hallucinogenic type of feel to it. And I think
did you see the cover? Even the cover of the album sort of plays into that a little
like
bit.
The freak show people, circus people.
Yep.
And,
on like a street, on the city street, no less, like they're just hanging out in the city.
And I did I'm glad you brought up the bass stuff, John, because I did notice that as well. There's a lot of good bass lines in this song, and or on this album, Strange Days, and some of the other ones as well. I noticed that. I like this album, for whatever reason, I feel like captures what they were trying to do better and sounds better than their other album. I'm interested to see, since we're going backward, what the first one is. It's going to be like the Big Bang, where we see where it all started, and
well, there's a lot of hits.
Understand it all. So I really liked, like Matt said, I think "Love Me Two Times" is probably the best one. I like it's a little bluesier too, which I appreciate, and there's some good guitar licks, and like we said, he yells on that song, which is great. When it feels earned when he yells, like, because he doesn't do it too often. It's like, oh yeah, that's the stuff right there.
That's a really good way of putting that, Josh. I like that.
Well, and so the eternal question about that is, "Love Me Two Times," is it literal or is it figurative? And that's what it's always been. Like, is it about, like, love me two times, like going into a relationship, or is it love me two times, let's bang twice? And people have argued about that for a long time. What's your take on that, Josh? And that's what's so fascinating about Jim Morrison. You can read it either of those ways, can't you, with how he sings it? Because he's sultry enough to make it be like, it's tumultuous relationship and we're gonna, fall in love two times. And he's also like Lizard King, like, fucking you on the stage, like enough to think that it's like baseline, like, let's get off twice.
Yeah, I would definitely lean towards just the more like sexual carnal interpretation of that song. And I mean, the horse latitudes, that's just the icing on the cake for this album. It doesn't seem out of place, because it's like, of course that he would put this like poetry in the middle of the album. It's also like a nightmare in a way, because of the effects that were around that, or the sound, or whatever.
Is that poetry though? Really? I mean, I'm not a.
I'm going to be all over that, Matt. I'm going to be all over that in my part. Yep.
Are all of the effects, because this is what I get frustrated when I start, at least when I'm researching my bands, are all the effects generated by the organ and the Moog in this? Like, is there a xylophone in one part?
There's other instrumentation, yes. Okay. They layered other stuff in.
Yeah, sometimes I'd like to know specifically what they're playing in the songs, and they don't always say that when we're doing research. So
well, some of it, remember, is that found sounds, too. So it's not... it's they're playing their regular instruments, but over the found sound to try to make it sound like a totally different instrument. Does that kind of make sense? And then they're backtracking it. So sometimes it isn't even an instrument as much as it's the instruments they're playing with, bizarre tracking done to it. So I think that's why it's hard to figure out exactly what you're hearing sometimes, especially since Raymond Zarek is playing like 5 different versions of, keys in different ways, the keys parts. Yeah.
Yeah. So hard to interpret too, or figure out that way just by listening.
He's like his own wall of sound, like, but
he's surrounded by keyboards.
Yes. He's like Phil Spector's dream in this. Yeah.
I guess my final thought is that this really is like the psychedelic sound. This is what you think of in a way when you talk about psychedelic music. The Doors is probably one of the first bands that come to people's minds that are familiar with this period and the sound. I think this captures it.
Yep. Well here, so the Doors are like the hardest band for me to summarize because I neither love nor hate the Doors. To me, the Doors are like a brand is the best way I could describe it. And I could dig into the music on this and this album to me at its most core sense is like most Doors albums. It's Jim Morrison's voice in two different formats, as you both have mentioned, like feral Jim Morrison or like droning Jim Morrison, or contemplative Jim Morrison, I guess is another way to put it. Whatever Ray Manzarek is doing on keys, and then ironically, because the person's not a member of the band, especially in later albums and especially their bluesy stuff, bass lines. And then the other stuff kind of exists in the background of it. But to me, the Doors are band as brand. And that's like for example, to me, the Doors are at their best when they're a blues band. They're actually, to me, I know Matt said they're overrated. I actually think they're an underrated blues band when they play blues songs. And, like later there will be like Roadhouse Blues and stuff like that, which I think is where the Doors are really at their best.
Yeah, that's great.
Yeah.
And then though, there's stuff like When the Music's Over, which if I were to describe like what's a Doors track that sounds like a bloated, like almost like version of the Doors that people roll their eyes at, it's When the Music's Over, because it takes forever, it's too long, the lyrics are supposed to be deep, but they're not really anything, and it's got that Jim Morrison voice where it's just drawn out, when the music's over, just like it takes a long time to get there, and I think we've all sort of indicated that's the lesser version of Jim Morrison. It also is so much like The End, it's weird to have a track that's almost the same thing on an album right after it. But there are some gems on this. I actually think Your Lost Little Girl is a really good song. I was surprised by how much I like that, and it's also a really good song lyrically. Strange Days is probably my favorite use of the Moog synthesizer that we've heard. I almost feel like it's how it's supposed to be used, if it's supposed to be used. I thought that was very good. I've always thought that I have never dropped acid, but I have always thought that, a lot of people will bring up songs that sound like what Being on Acid is, but I always thought People Are Strange sounds like what Being on Acid would be like for at least 2 minutes and 10 seconds, because it's sort of that kaleidoscopic feel where you can almost see like, Jim Morrison on a vision quest, which he literally was when he wrote it pretty much. So it's like this album's all of the good of the Doors, all of the bad of the Doors, but it's a great album to listen to if you want to like understand what the Doors are, because it gives you everything. There's experimentation, there's psychedelia, there's both versions of Jim Morrison's voice, there's an organ orgy, as I put it, on a lot of Doors songs, and good,
true.
Bad, and different. And there's even Jim Morrison spoken word poetry. And I will share a story with you very quick. So when I was in high school, I took a class called Survey of Poetry, which I loved, with a teacher by the name of Bill O'Brien, who I later had the pleasure of working with. He actually passed away earlier this year, so R.I.P. to Bill. He was a huge influence on me when I was a teacher, but he had a thing where you would put together compilations of poems from different poets, and you would write stuff, and reviews and just different stuff like that. And he was more of a classic poets. If he was going in modern poetry, he wanted folks to sort of adhere to the standards. So I got to a point in the class where I'd done a bunch like Keats and Donne and Yeats and, wonderful, William Carlos Williams, wonderful poets. But I had enough points in the queue, not that the grade was going to discourage me from this, but I decided to play it dead straight and submit a combination of poems from Jim Morrison and Rod McEwen, who is a contemporary poet, and basically write about them dead seriously as if I was writing about like the work of, the masters, right? From the Romantic period and like the English period periods where there were sonnets and stuff. And I can remember writing, and I'm going to try to find this, guys, because I think I may still have it because I found so much humor in it. Horse Latitudes was one of the poems that I included in that, and I wrote about it dead seriously with profound. And my take, so that you know, is that poetry is not music, because real poetry is using rhyme and structure to create the feel that music is in a song, right? And to me, lyrics are prose, because if you're playing music behind a piece of writing, to me, to some degree, you're creating the rhythm and the tenor. Whereas true poetry in the traditional sense, the symmetry and the sound comes from the words themselves and how they're spoken. I know that there's a lot of people that will feel differently about that, and I'm not going to sit here and argue that I'm right or wrong with it, but that's where I stand. So if you want to know where I stand on, is Jim Morrison a poet? I would say no. He is a songwriter who veers into prose.
But you wrote about him as he was.
I wrote about him as if he was a contemporary of Donne and Keats and Yeats, and I apparently.
Yeah, how was that? How did that land, John?
Yeah.
Well, my teacher, who was an intense guy, notoriously said at first he was thinking about how he was going to strangle me, but then as he read it, he appreciated just the pure absurdity of how much detail was put into playing it as straight as possible, to the point where he had to laugh afterwards. And he did admit that reading the poems, while they were, as he put it, abuses of the English language, were in the context of how the stuff was written, provided him with quite a bit of humor as satire. So that was, as Hayek, for me, and you guys know me pretty well, the things like that are worth, you could give me all the A's in the world, but I'd take a B or a C and have that comment attached to it. So yeah.
Yeah. That's what kind of gets me to a degree with guys like Morrison, right? So there's obviously a decision to put this track on the record, right? And I'm just like, I don't know enough about Jim Morrison to know, did he, is this it must have been very meaningful for him, or it must have meant something deep.
Well, he was a poet before he was in the Doors. He viewed himself as a poet who just happened to be in a band eventually.
Yeah, this is what goes into the ridiculous nature of the Doors, where it's just right. You're just, I don't know. But
that's what I said. Are they a cliche, or or did they become a cliche because lots of people tried to play Jim Morrison?
Yeah. No,
if the Doors had existed and people didn't try to be Jim Morrison, right? Because there were lots of people that tried to be Jim Morrison. Would he just be this unique pop figure that people were like, what an enigma? You know what I mean? He's kind of ridiculous, but he's lovably ridiculous.
Yeah, and I think I could probably say it like this, because I'm with you, John. I neither love nor hate this band. I'm a little bit neutral on them. I mean, there's certain aspects that I do like, but I think I totally get why someone would love this band, and I get why someone would hate this band.
Sure.
It makes, I think, all opinions of the Doors, in my mind, are absolutely valid and 100% correct. So
that's why
Venn diagram of
and
it's one circle.
Yeah. Well, and once again, that's why they're a brand, right? Because I feel like in many ways they're being analyzed. It's like, how do you feel about the Kardashians, right? I mean, not that the Kardashians and Doors have a lot in common, but you know what I mean? There's going to be people that are like, the Kardashians influence, how I do stuff, and I want to be a professional influencer. There's people like, I hate them and they're vile, boils on society, and then there's people who view them as sort of this bizarre cultural element of its time, right? And that's, to some degree, the Doors for the late 60s and early 70s. You could do worse than picking the Doors as the mascot for that era.
Yeah, right. Yeah.
Yeah, no.
But I go back. For me, it's Ray Manzarek saves this band.
The bass lines are damn good too, man.
Well, and that's I agree with that. And I didn't mention that earlier, but I was thinking the same thing. I'm like, man, I'm hearing a lot of bass in here, and I don't know. Initially, I thought, is Robbie Krieger just playing something very low on the guitar, and then later on, I was going, no, this is definitely the bass. I wasn't sure about that, so I'm glad you cleared that up. But you're right. I did like parts of that too. But the Doors sound is to me, is Ray Manzarek and the keys.
So here's something because we're going to cover, I think it's 4 of the 5 Doors albums. So as we go on, I'll plant this in your head, and then we'll end this segment. I want you to think as we go on, if the Doors just released their blues songs across the albums we covered as an 8-disc album, I want you to think about how you'd feel about that album. And I want to revisit that thought, because I really do think that the influence of the Doors eventually, beyond Jim Morrison sort of creating the frontman that like Jimmy Page would eventually be, you know what I mean? Or like Steven Tyler, right? To some degree, they're different, but they all sort of try to get that vibe, right? But they also were influential as a blues band and Matt, you have to put aside your view, but like they were influential as a blues band to like bands like the Eagles and stuff, because you can draw a direct line of playing that bluesy type of music. And I like I said, I think that they might be overrated as a general band, but underrated as a blues band. And that's what's fascinating about the Doors. It's that Venn diagram thing that isn't a Venn diagram that you talked about. They're everything and nothing at the same time.
Yeah.
Yep. So there you go. Any final thoughts before we move to Josh and the band?
Listeners, let us know what your thoughts are on the Doors, because they're the most, I think, one of the most interesting bands that we've talked about.
I will certainly give them that. I will absolutely give them that. Yeah.
When we talk about the actual music, probably less in Doors albums than we do in any other band. To something that's kind of what I did.
That's a good point.
Yeah.
So okay.